We can be paralyzed by the amount of change or blind to everything around us that's moving chaotically. What I'm going to do is walk you through the tactics, tools, and techniques that we've used to help NASA prototype the journey to Mars and working with about 700 brands, billionaires, and CEOs in the quest to predict and create the future. But we're also going to have a little bit of fun doing this. So let me put it out there. What do you want to talk about and study today? Horse dimensions or spaceships? You're probably thinking spaceships, but you know, fine, we'll do spaceships. Just kidding, psych, let's talk about horse dimensions. Now you're really wondering where I'm going with this. Let me reword this in a different way to make it a little less peculiar, but still a bit of a riddle. There are no horses in space, but a smart and successful person like you should expect that there is exactly 2 horses in space. And since we're talking horse dimensions, you should expect those horses to be 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Now, that doesn't really make sense, but I'll tell you, it is important to note that the width of NASA's solid rocket boosters were determined based on 2 horses. And if you want to understand why, I'll tell you at first that you'll be surprised it's not a coincidence. Those rockets are specifically designed to be the width of 2 horses, and to figure it out, you'd have to go all the way back to the Roman era. You'd notice in the Roman Empire that they had the broadest land, and they could patrol that land with a 2-horse Roman war chariot. But the war chariots tore up the little dirt roads throughout Europe, and all of a sudden there's ruts everywhere. So if you were a little farmer pulling your wagon through a rut, you might break a wagon wheel, and you'd have to fix it. And if you did, and if you were a smart farmer, you might measure the width of those ruts to realize that they are 4 foot 8.5 inches apart, just like the width of the Roman war chariot. So pretty soon, everybody making a wagon started making that wagon 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Next up, we start gold mining, and we start pulling basically carts on rail tracks, not with trains or engines, of course, but with horses. And we set those wagonways apart by 4 foot 8.5 inches. The Europeans start making the first trains, and they put them then on tracks that are how wide? 4 foot 8.5 inches. The Americans make their own trains and tracks. And as random trivia, the tracks are not connected to the tracks in Europe, obviously. And yet, they still put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Pretty soon, we rip up all the tracks for bigger, badder, faster trains, and yet we stick with the standard 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Some trains go 200 miles an hour, many of which are on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. And so when NASA needs to ship the solid rocket boosters from Utah down to Florida, they have to put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Now, if you're clever, you'll take a look at the image and you'll say, but Jeremy, the solid rocket boosters are a bit wider than the track. Sure, but it doesn't change the fact that the width of the solid rocket boosters for outer space are determined by the width of 2 horses' butts. Now, I probably ruined spaceships for you now. You're only going to think of horses and horse butts, but there's an interesting takeaway here. That width is stupid, and we're probably worse off for it, and yet it illustrates that we're more dependent on our past decisions than we like to think.